Thanks so much, Julianne. Well, Puerto Rico is actually quite important to the U.S. It's not a state. It's an unincorporated territory or commonwealth. And so while Puerto Ricans are citizens, Puerto Rico itself doesn't have the same set of institutions and laws and federal laws affecting it that other states do. And so when Puerto Rico declared that it could not pay its bills, basically, in 2015, there was a requirement to help Puerto Rico get out of the mess, but the laws weren't there necessarily to help it. So the US government decided that it would put in place a financial management and oversight board for Puerto Rico. And luckily for us, the son of OCAMIC member David Skeel, who is David Skeel Jr., is the chair of PROMESA, the board that oversees the financial oversight of Puerto Rico and the restructuring of its debt. And we weren't sure as IOLR whether when we would be able to schedule a presentation from him. He's presented before, and thank goodness he agreed to present again. So we recorded the session, and it starts with an introduction by David Skeel Sr., and then a presentation by David Skeel Jr., who is with us today. You can see him for the moment on screen. And he's going to be available for questions and answers after the presentation. So we'll go ahead now with the recording. Thank you.
Commission retired, and David was selected as the... Good evening. It is my honor and distinct pleasure to introduce Professor David A. Skeel Jr. to our OCAMIC audience, where he loves to give talks because the audience is so informed and intelligent. Professor Skeel comes to us from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He started his academic career at the University of North Carolina and was Phi Beta Kappa there, and went from there to the University of Virginia, where he was law review. He did his clerkship in Wilmington with the U.S. Third Court of Appeals. After that, he went to Philadelphia and joined a prestigious law firm. But after 2 years there, he decided that he did not want to spend the rest of his life as a Philadelphia lawyer. So he joined the academic world at Temple University and was asked to be the visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School across town. After his stint there, he was solicited to become a member of their faculty, which he did and has been there ever since. He has been a visiting professor at a large number of prestigious institutions, including Harvard, New York University, Wisconsin, Northwestern, University of Virginia. For 10 summers, he taught at a prestigious school in Rome. His first book was a history of the development of the bankruptcy law in the United States. And that came out as the Enron problem became a big factor in American news. So then he became an overnight celebrity. He was on NPR, PBS, Larry Kudlow, and numerous other television programs. His topic tonight is on the Puerto Rican financial crisis. He was nominated by Senator Mitch McConnell to become a member of the President's Commission to oversee the resurrection and correction of the Puerto Rican financial system. He was then selected by President Obama to join this seven-man commission, of which he was the only lawyer. For several years, he worked diligently on the commission, and subsequently the chairman of the commission retired, and David was selected as the next chairman, position which he has held for over 3 or 4 years. Tonight he's going to talk about Puerto Rico, so let us give a good old-fashioned Okamic welcome to Professor David A. Skeel, Jr.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here again. I'm physically here, and you'll see this virtually in due course. I would come here solely for my dad's introductions, if for nothing else, but I really enjoy these Okamic sessions on lots of different levels. This is the 3rd or 4th time I've come to talk about Puerto Rico, and as my dad was saying, this is the best audience anywhere, given the level of knowledge about what's going on and the interesting questions and back and forth we have. So what I'm going to do is, for about 40 minutes, I would guess, talk about where things are with PROMESA, the legislation in 2016 that created an oversight board, and with the restructuring in particular of Puerto Rico's debt. We can move to the next slide. Thanks. So here is a roadmap of what I'll talk about in the next 35, 40, 45 minutes. First, I'll talk just a little bit about Puerto Rico's financial crisis, a little bit of the background, give a 30,000-foot view of what happened before 2016. Second, I will talk about PROMESA, the legislation in 2016 that created the Oversight Board. Talk a little bit about other oversight boards that have been created in the past and how we're a little bit different from those other boards. Third, I will talk very quickly about some of the obstacles and challenges we faced in the last 6 years, some of which are things that I'm quite confident many people who are watching are quite aware of. Then I'll home in on the Puerto Rico restructuring, the restructuring of the Commonwealth's debt, which was about $35 billion of debt at the Commonwealth level and $55 billion of unfunded pensions. Just talk a little bit about what I think are some really innovative features of that restructuring, which was completed just a few months ago, back in March 2022. And then I'll conclude by talking about where we are now, what's left, what things look like after 6 years. So first, the crisis, then the mechanics of how the board works and how it compares to other boards, then some of the obstacles and challenges we faced in the past 6 years, then a bit about the restructuring, and finally, where we are here, where we are now, and I will look forward to questions about any of this, or really anything related to Puerto Rico as well. So next slide. So the crisis goes back to at least 2006. So it started really a decade before PROMESA was put in place, and lots of factors that went into it. Puerto Rico has been a territory of the United States since 1898. It's had an awkward relationship with the United States since then. Over more than a century, there are a number of constraints that they face as a result of that. I'm going to put all of that to the side for the moment and focus on the near-term biggest obvious cause of the deep financial crisis that Puerto Rico found itself in. That was the phase out of a tax break, tax provision that was Section 936 of the Internal Revenue Code, so people just refer to it as 936. What that tax break did is it allowed American corporations that could claim to be generating profits in Puerto Rico not to be taxed on those profits. So if you could build a plant in Puerto Rico, or if you could configure your business so that you were generating profits in Puerto Rico, you were exempt from federal income tax. What that did is it made Puerto Rico very attractive for small, lightweight manufacturing industries, things like pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and the like. Many of them came to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was getting a significant portion of its yearly budget from those corporations. And that tax break was taken away. Ultimately, the legislation that took it away was put in place in 1996. There were some rumblings before that about possibly taking it away. The criticism of the legislation was that it looked to people like corporate welfare. So pharmaceutical companies like Microsoft, were putting intellectual property in Puerto Rico and attributing profits to Puerto Rico, generating a few jobs in Puerto Rico, but not a huge number, and getting this huge tax break. So it became quite controversial. There was a movement of sorts to get rid of it in the early 1990s. Bob Woodward, in one of his books, a book called The Agenda, talks about how Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan kind of single-handedly fended off the reform in 1993. He told President Clinton, he had a private dinner with President Clinton, told him that if this tax break were taken away, Puerto Rico lost this stream of revenues that was that the Puerto Rico economy was getting from these pharmaceutical companies, that there might be revolution in the Caribbean, the unemployment rate in Puerto Rico would double, thousands and thousands of Puerto Ricans would migrate to New York, and it would increase the U.S.'s welfare costs. It would just be a complete disaster, Moynihan said, and Clinton was persuaded and didn't do anything for a couple of years. But then in 1996, President Clinton, and Newt Gingrich ended up reaching a deal on a balanced budget proposal that they needed to get rid of some tax breaks to help fund, and they ended up focusing on 936 and ultimately eliminating 936. And a footnote on this that goes to or says something about the complexity of the status issue in Puerto Rico is that at the time, in 1996, Puerto Rico had a pro-statehood governor, a governor who wanted Puerto Rico to become a state. You would think whoever the governor of Puerto Rico would lobby as hard as he or she could against a removal of this massive source of revenues for Puerto Rico. But the governor didn't. The governor was a governor named Pedro Rosselló, didn't really lobby against it. Why didn't he lobby against it? Well, it's thought the reason that he didn't lobby very hard was because 936 was something that made Puerto Rico look different than a state. 936, this tax break for corporations that put their revenues on the island is something that no state had. In fact, these corporations were treated as foreign corporations for the purpose or Puerto Rico was treated as a foreign jurisdiction for the purpose of the tax code. So he didn't lobby against it, and it was taken away. It was taken away over a 10-year period from 1996 to 2006. What ideally would have happened in that 10 years is that Puerto Rico would have reconfigured its economy and found a way to replace some of those revenues, cut its spending to keep its budget in line. But that's not what Puerto Rico did. What Puerto Rico did, in a nutshell, was funded the deficits created by losing 936 by issuing debt. Now, why could they issue debt, and why was debt a solution, borrowing money a solution to what now was a very big gap in their budget? Well, there are 2 or 3 factors that made this possible and really magnified the crisis that resulted. One was a kind of astonishing ruling by the Secretary of Justice of Puerto Rico, which is the equivalent of the equivalent of an Attorney General. Back in 1974, the Secretary of Justice issued a ruling that said money that was borrowed counted as revenues for the purposes of balancing your budget. So if Puerto Rico borrowed a bunch of money, even if they didn't increase their revenues, they could count that borrowed money as revenues for the purpose of balancing the budget. It was just a crazy, crazy ruling, but it was in place from 1974 on. So when Puerto Rico borrowed money, it could treat those proceeds as if they were revenues and use them to help balance the budget. Second thing Puerto Rico did was it created a massive off-balance sheet way to borrow money. And what they did was they took a portion of their sales tax revenues, took them off the budget, created something called COFINA, which was an entity that was created simply to issue debt, to borrow money, and to repay that money with sales tax revenues. Didn't count as debt because Puerto Rico treated it as if it was not Puerto Rico debt. It was a separate entity that was borrowing money. This is a trick that many states and cities do as well. When they're at risk of going over their debt limits in their constitution, they will sometimes borrow money by moving revenues away from the state or the city, and that's something that Puerto Rico did as well. The last thing that Puerto Rico did the last thing that helped Puerto Rico to continue borrowing money, even when it was clear Puerto Rico was in serious financial trouble, is that Puerto Rico debt is triple tax exempt. It is exempt from federal taxes, it's exempt from any state tax, and it's exempt from any local tax. This is a result of a 1917 law that was the same law that gave U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans. It was designed to kind of help Puerto Rico's out, make it easier for Puerto Rico to borrow money as needed. And it had that effect, but it ended up having a destructive effect as well. So to say a word more about how that works and what that means is, again, any debt issued by Puerto Rico is exempt from every kind of tax you can imagine, not just federal, not just state, but federal, state, and local. And to give you an example of how that differs from bonds issued by a state, for instance, when Pennsylvania, my state, issues bonds, if I buy a Pennsylvania bond, that bond will be exempt from federal tax, and it'll also be exempt from state tax if I pay state tax in Pennsylvania. But if I were to if I were to buy a California bond, I'm a Pennsylvania resident. If I were to buy a California bond, that would be exempt from federal tax. It would not be exempt from Pennsylvania state tax. It's only exempt from California tax, not from the tax of other states. Puerto Rico debt is like debt of every state combined. It's exempt from all state taxes. which means no matter where somebody lives on the mainland, Florida, Pennsylvania, anywhere else, it's exempt from those taxes. What that meant was that every municipal bond fund in the country had a significant amount of Puerto Rico debt going into 2016. They would buy that along with their local state debt. So a Pennsylvania municipal bond fund would buy Pennsylvania bonds and Puerto Rico bonds. A Florida bond fund would buy Florida bonds and Puerto Rico bonds. So it was very easy for Puerto Rico to sell its bonds. All of these things, the way debt was treated, the clever things used to generate new ways to issue debt, the triple tax exemption, made it really, really easy for Puerto Rico to borrow money until the very end. And the very end came in 2015 when the then governor of Puerto Rico said, our debts are unpayable. We just can't pay them. And that's what caused Congress to spring into action. We go to the next one, thanks. So what Congress did in 2016 is it created a 7-member oversight board. Each of the congressional leaders, which back then were Paul Ryan, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Mitch McConnell, got to nominate people for 1 or 2 slots on that 7-member board. They had to nominate multiple people for each of their slots, and then President Obama picked from their nominees. And as my dad was saying earlier, I was nominated by Mitch McConnell and then was one of the people that President Obama selected. Footnote on this nomination process, it's a little different than the nomination process when you are appointing a cabinet member for the president, the secretary of the treasury, or the education secretary, or appointing a judge, a federal judge or a Supreme Court justice. In those situations, the way the nomination works is the president nominates and then the entire Senate votes to confirm the nominee. And that's called Senate confirmation, as most people in this room probably know and have watched a number of times. Shortly after we were created, about a year after we were created in 2017, a hedge fund filed a complaint arguing that we were illegally appointed, that under the Appointments Clause of the Constitution, we should have been confirmed by the Senate. We shouldn't have been picked by individual congressional leaders. Our appointment was unconstitutional, and therefore the restructuring that we were doing of Puerto Rico's debt should be thrown out. The reason that they brought this suit is they didn't like the way the restructuring was going, and so they tried to blow up the process. This case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, so the only time I've ever been involved in a Supreme Court case in my 35-plus years in the legal and academic profession was as a party in this case that was decided in 2020, which was very cool, especially given that we won in the end. It would have been a little less cool if we hadn't. It turns out that we have another Supreme Court case. Supreme Court just agreed to hear a case that involves whether an investigative journalism outfit can force us to provide every contact that we've had with Puerto Rico lawmakers or with U.S. lawmakers. That issue is going to the Supreme Court, so it looks like I will be a party in a second Supreme Court case, but I'll push that to the side. Thanks. So here's a picture of President Obama with the 7 of us. You may not see anything there, and that's because there's no picture. I was hoping that when I got appointed to the Oversight Board, the coolest thing was going to be that wonderful picture where you're with the president, with the sitting president. We didn't ever have a picture with the sitting president. I got renominated eventually by President Trump. Don't have a picture with him as well. So that was not one of the benefits of this service. So I'll have to keep trying, I suppose. Next slide. So here's a little bit on what we do, what PROMESA is about. We have two primary roles, we being this 7-person oversight board. The first thing that we do is we certify fiscal plans and budgets. That's the fiscal responsibility part of PROMESA. What Congress decided when it put PROMESA in place was that it would give Puerto Rico the ability to restructure its debt, but the price for that would be they'd have an oversight board that would do the restructuring and also would oversee the budgets until the budgets were back in balance. And so we certify 5-year fiscal plans every year. Each year we redo the fiscal plan. And all of the budgets of Puerto Rico have to be consistent with those fiscal plans, or we can invalidate the budget. We can invalidate ultimately legislation that's inconsistent with the budget. So that's the first major thing that we do. The second major thing that we do is we have the authority to restructure Puerto Rico's debt. For reasons that nobody can fully explain, Puerto Rico had no debt restructuring option when it fell into this financial crisis in the first decade and a half of the 2000s. If you are a state and a major city is in financial distress, like Michigan with Detroit, Michigan has the power to allow, and did have the power to allow, Detroit to file for bankruptcy under what we call municipal bankruptcy law, or Chapter 9 of the bankruptcy laws. California could allow Stockton to file for bankruptcy, could allow San Bernardino to file for bankruptcy. They all filed for bankruptcy. Puerto Rico didn't have that option for reasons that nobody can satisfactorily explain. In 1984, Congress adopted a definition of what a state is under the bankruptcy laws that had the effect of making it impossible for Puerto Rico to allow any of its municipalities or government corporations to use Chapter 9. And what that definition of state said was that Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. are states for every purpose except access to Chapter 9, access to municipal bankruptcy laws. So Puerto Rico's in trouble. It has a bunch of entities that are also in trouble. The electricity company, which is called PREPA, was in trouble. The water company was thought to be in some trouble, but it couldn't use bankruptcy to restructure them. So Puerto Rico, since it couldn't use Chapter 9, tried to create its own bankruptcy system that looked just like Chapter 9. That got challenged by some bondholders. That went to the Supreme Court, and right before PROMESA was enacted, it was struck down by the Supreme Court. So before PROMESA, no bankruptcy option, either Chapter 9 or Puerto Rico's own self-created bankruptcy framework was available. PROMESA gave this back, and it created two types of restructuring option. The first is Title VI of PROMESA. It's a little bit like the mechanism that's used to restructure the bonds of countries. So many countries now have bonds that have voting provisions in them that are called collective action provisions that provide that if a majority or a supermajority of bondholders agree to a restructuring, the bonds are restructured. So it's a very simple restructuring mechanism. Title VI provides for that. It also provides, or PROMESA also provides for Title III, something called Title III, which is really a lot like municipal bankruptcy. It adopts a lot of municipal bankruptcy provisions. The one really big step beyond that Title III takes is Title III allowed Puerto Rico itself, not just its municipalities, not just its government corporations, but Puerto Rico itself to file for bankruptcy. And we put Puerto Rico into bankruptcy in 2017. After Hurricane Maria, which I'll say a word more about in a minute, in 2017, we learned to our chagrin that there's a difference between an oversight board and a control board. Washington, D.C. in the 1990s had a control board where the board essentially had control of the city government. In Detroit in 2013 and 2014, there was an emergency manager. The emergency manager had control of the Detroit government. Kevin Orr, the emergency manager, essentially displaced the mayor and city council of New York. We are not a control board. We are an oversight board, and there are a couple of really important limitations to our power, as we learned after Hurricane Maria. One is that we cannot take operational control over any part of the government. We cannot operate the government on a day-to-day basis. We tried to take over the electricity company. We asked the judge to put in place what we called a chief transformation officer, and the government of Puerto Rico resisted that, and we put it before the federal judge, and she said, "You are not Washington, D.C. The Congress deliberately gave us less power than the Washington, D.C. control board. You cannot take control of the electricity company or any other part of the Puerto Rico government." We also can't pass legislation. If there are things that we think Puerto Rico needs, we have no power to pass legislation. That goes through the normal legislative process, the House and Senate of Puerto Rico passing it, and the governor signing it if he wants to sign it. Why do we have less power than some of these other oversight boards? The simple answer is because of concerns about Puerto Rico's sovereignty and concerns about the awkward status Puerto Rico has. Puerto Rico is a colony, and it's been a colony since 1898. It's very controversial in the long run. In my view, it's an unstable, unsustainable status. One effect of that for these purposes is Congress was willing to put in place a board that would have powers that you probably could not do constitutionally with any state. Congress had the power because of the Territories Clause of Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution, but Congress wasn't willing to put in place a board that could just take over the government because of concerns about Puerto Rico's sovereignty, very legitimate concerns, in my view, despite the difficulties at times this creates for us. So that, thanks, next would be great. So that is a little bit about what we do. What we have encountered in the last 6 years, as Puerto Rico has encountered in the last 6 years, has really been one challenge or obstacle after another. This picture isn't challenges or obstacles, I don't think. This is just my fellow board members very early on. That picture was probably taken in 2017 or thereabouts in our offices in San Juan, and that's most of the board members and some of our executive director. Footnote on that, as some of you may remember, the executive director is the woman on the right-hand side of the table, halfway down the table. She's the former Minister of Finance of Ukraine, and she was our executive director for 5 years. She stepped down in April. She had already announced that she was stepping down before the invasion of Ukraine, but it turned out to be kind of providential, fortunate timing, because she's heavily involved in the Ukraine effort, or has been heavily involved. So that's just a picture of us. If we go to the next slide, we hit some of the actual challenges. The picture on the right is a wanted poster, or one of the wanted posters that showed up all over the campus of University of Pennsylvania, where I teach, in the summer of 2018. And what the poster says is that I'm a law professor at the University of Penn, a mercenary against the people of Puerto Rico, member of the U.S. Congress-appointed Fiscal Control Board. As I was just mentioning a minute ago, we're not actually a control board, but that's what they said, which demands the blood of Puerto Rican people to pay rich Wall Street bondholders. When the first thing that I was struck by when I saw these posters, I actually didn't see them in person. I started getting texts from folks who saw them and said, what's going on here is I was very puzzled at why they chose the picture that they chose for this wanted poster. It's not easy to find a good picture of me or even a decent picture of me anywhere on the internet, but they seem to pick the only one where I don't look like I'm some evil villain to go with this text, which was very much saying that I am an evil villain. After these wanted posters came out, which were frustrating in one sense, which is I felt like they misrepresented what we were doing. We were actually restructuring the debt of these bondholders, not doing everything that the bondholders want. I wrote a little op-ed where I said I wish I could introduce these protesters to actual Wall Street bondholders because those actual Wall Street bondholders really don't like us very much either and think that we're working too hard to restructure their debt. After I wrote that op-ed, one of the main bondholders, which was a hedge fund that filed the case against us trying to get the board dismissed as unconstitutional, wrote a letter back to the Wall Street Journal, which is where this op-ed was. And the letter said that everything Skeel says in his column is untrue, except for the part about us hating him. That we actually do hate him and hate them. But this was one of many protests, particularly that we encountered early on. The first public meeting that we had in New York City, there were protests. There still are regularly protests on the island when we have meetings on the island. The picture on the left is the police presence before our first meeting in Puerto Rico. Now, it was a bit of an overkill. I don't think they needed all those police there, but it does give you a little bit of a sense that we're not all that popular. What we're doing is challenging, to put it mildly, and we don't get protests quite as much as we did back in the beginning, but we do still get protests from folks who are not happy with what we're doing. Next slide. Thanks. This is a slide of some students and me with the then governor of Puerto Rico. The governor is in the middle. The students, I taught a seminar about Puerto Rico in spring of 2017. We went to Puerto Rico and visited, among other places, the governor's palace, which is a spectacular old Spanish mansion in Old San Juan. The governor at that time, it was during a period of glasnost with the governor, when we and the governor were getting along pretty well, and he gave us a personal guided tour of the governor's mansion. So everything seemed pretty cheerful then. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that 2 years later, things were not cheerful at all. There were massive protests against the governor, Governor Ricardo Rosselló, who is the son of Pedro Rosselló, whom I mentioned earlier. During the summer of 2019, there was a corruption scandal that didn't involve the governor directly, but involved some of his officials. And then what really blew up the protests was 899 pages of internal what became known as the chat among the governor and his top advisors on an internet or a service known as Telegram, which are messages that disappear a little while after you send the messages. Somebody took screenshots of 899 pages of their internal discussions, and the discussions were sexist and homophobic and vulgar, very, very offensive, and led to massive protests and ultimately forced Rosselló to resign in summer 2019, which created another major hiccup in governance in Puerto Rico. Then the next slide is there was a substantial earthquake in December 2019, and actually I think I skipped past. All right, I guess I left out Hurricane Maria. I don't even have Hurricane. These are all challenges without including Hurricane Maria, which was in 2017, which was the biggest of the challenges of all, and destroyed the electricity grid, really set the island back years. Then we had the protests with the governor. The governor was forced out. Then we had these earthquakes. The first one was, I think, 6.4 on the Richter scale, and then there was a whole wave of them for weeks after, what is called a seismic swarm, really devastated the southwest part of the island, which is where this picture was taken from. So that caused a lot of trouble. If we go to the next slide, we've got the pandemic. What that is this obviously is a challenge that was faced and we're still sort of in it, all over the country. What that is the little barcode that you had to get if you wanted to go to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico really shut down hard during the pandemic. They were very, very aggressive, really kind of the opposite of Florida. Whereas Florida was on the open end of the spectrum, Puerto Rico was very much on the closed end, shut everything down. Even relatively recently, you had to be vaccinated. You had to have had a test within a couple of days of flying to Puerto Rico. That's not true right now, but the shutdown of the economy there, as elsewhere, was very difficult. And then finally, last of these slides, is more recently, a few weeks ago, Hurricane Fiona. Hurricane Fiona was much less immediately devastating than Hurricane Maria was. Hurricane Maria damaged primarily because of the winds and the way it wrecked everything. Hurricane Fiona, most of the damage was through flooding, particularly again in the southwest part of the island, as you can see in that picture. So it's really been one crisis or challenge or obstacle after another for the past 6 years. We can go to the next slide. So that's one reason that the restructuring of the debt, which is a big part of what we were put there to do, and it's really why I'm on the oversight board. I'm on the oversight board because I'm a restructuring and bankruptcy person. One reason that it took so long, it took 5 years, was because there was just one major setback after another. Maria, the governor's ouster, the earthquakes, the pandemic. But we finally confirmed a restructuring plan in January of 2022. So January was when the federal judge approved the plan. Then it became official in March of 2022. This is I'm not going to go through each of those creditors and what they were paid, but this is a snapshot of what that restructuring did. There's $30 or $35 billion of debt. The biggest debt is the general obligation bonds, and they got the biggest payout. And there were a variety of other kinds of debt as well that got smaller payouts. But rather than going into the nuts and bolts of exactly what the plan did, I want to talk about a couple really innovative things that came out of that restructuring. We can go to the next slide. Thanks. So the first of the two things I want to talk about is something called a contingent value instrument. One of the huge problems we had throughout the negotiations with the creditors was that we, the Oversight Board, and the creditors had very, very different opinions of what Puerto Rico could afford to pay. Our view was there's huge amount of disaster money coming in because of the hurricanes and the earthquakes and the pandemic, and our view was and is that Puerto Rico is going to have significant surpluses for a couple of years, but then there's a real risk that they're going to go back to possibly even to deficits. Our fiscal plans project that unless they make some more structural changes, they're likely to be deficits in 15 or 20 years. So we thought the capacity to repay was quite limited. The creditors argued that Puerto Rico could basically pay everything that we owed, made it really, really hard to reach an agreement. We concluded in the last round of negotiations that we would not go above $1.15 billion a year in future debt obligations. $1.15 billion a year is between 7 and 8% of Puerto Rico's revenues. And our view was Puerto Rico can afford to pay that going forward, even if the economy struggles for a while. But we thought it was essential for Puerto Rico to be saddled with more debt than it could handle. So we really held the line at what turned out to be $1.15 billion. Problem was that the creditors thought they were entitled to a lot more than that. We also needed a way to pay not just the major group of bondholders, the general obligation bondholders, but the other creditors as well. The solution we reached was a contingent value instrument. And the idea of a contingent value instrument is that if the economy does well, the creditors get more. If the economy does not do well, the creditors don't get any more. It's a great idea in concept. It's a great way to bridge the gap between the debtor and its creditors and to just let the future tell how much they get paid. The problem with contingent value instruments is they don't have a great track record. They've been used in the international context. Typically, the contingent value instruments are based on GDP, what the gross domestic product is year by year. The problem with GDP is that GDP is a pretty fuzzy number, and it's kind of manipulable. And so it's very, very hard to come up with a contingent value instrument based on GDP that works well and that the parties believe in. And this turned out to be the case in Ukraine. Ukraine had a contingent value instrument when it's restructured its debt back in 2015, 2016, when our former executive director was finance minister, and it didn't work all that well from Ukraine's perspective. And so there was a little bit of a hesitancy to use a contingent value instrument. But we came up with one that I think really, really is going to work well. And it's really an example of taking lemons and creating lemonade, to use the old cliche. I talked earlier about COFINA, the sales tax debt, and the fact that that was a way to kind of disguise the fact that Puerto Rico was issuing even more debt to get it off the balance sheet. The upside of that is the sales tax is there. It's being used for debt already. And sales tax turns out to be a very, very measurable number. You can precisely determine what your sales tax is in any given year. It's difficult to manipulate. So that's one really nice feature of it. The other nice feature of it is that if your sales tax revenues are going up, the economy is almost certainly doing well. Lots of other measures that you could use for contingent value instruments might be misleading. They might go up when the economy is not actually going up. But if the sales tax revenues are going up, your economy is probably doing pretty well. So the CVI, the sales tax CVI, played a huge role in the restructuring, and I think it's going to work very, very well. It has paid off a lot this year, and I suspect folks are going to use similar devices in future cases like this in the future. We can move to the next one. The one other thing that we did in this plan that I thought was quite innovative and I think is going to be important had to do with responding to concerns we and lots of people have that as soon as this is done, what's to keep Puerto Rico from issuing too much debt again? What's to keep Puerto Rico from making pension promises that it can't pay? I mentioned earlier that the pensions in Puerto Rico were $50 billion, $55 billion, almost completely unfunded. $55 billion in obligations, less than $1 billion in funding. How do you stop them from immediately going back to the old bad habits of making promises, not funding those promises going forward? What we did is we put some provisions into the restructuring plan, into the plan of adjustment. It's a little bit like a strategy that the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, uses when it lends money to a company that's in distress. And what these provisions did is they said for a period of 10 years, Puerto Rico's debt is strictly limited. No debt can be issued that is over, it's about a little less than 8% of revenues as calculated in the plan. So if Puerto Rico were to try to issue debt that went over that number, any one of the parties to the restructuring could go to court and say they can't do that. That's inconsistent with the plan. Did this similar sort of thing with the pensions. There's a provision in the plan that says Puerto Rico for 10 years cannot put in place any new defined benefit pension promise. A defined benefit pension promise is a promise that just says we're going to pay you a certain amount each year after you retire. That was the type of pension that Puerto Rico created and did not fund in the past. The other thing that we did for pensions is we're concerned that the existing pension obligations, the pension obligations that had accrued as of the bankruptcy, wouldn't be paid in the future, that Puerto Rico would not have enough money in the future. So what we did is we put a provision into the plan that requires surpluses, significant portion of future surpluses, to be set aside to fund a trust for those pensions. And in this year, over $1 billion will be put into that trust. Over the 10-year, I don't remember if it's exactly 10 years, but over the life of this trust funding arrangement, we're estimating that about $10 billion will be set aside to protect the pensions. So that's the plan. By way of conclusion, if we can skip to the last slide, I'll just very quickly talk about where things stand now. One of the big issues that is still an issue in Puerto Rico, has been an issue from the beginning, is the electricity company. PREPA, the electricity company, was a disaster before PROMESA was put in place. The night before our first public meeting, Puerto Rico lost electricity back in 2016, a year before Hurricane Maria. Hurricane Fiona, just a few weeks ago, also wiped out electricity across the island. There was a better response after Fiona than there was after Maria. But it's still a problem. PREPA is in bankruptcy. We've been negotiating the debt for years. And we've been in mediation. We recently reached an impasse with the bondholders. We're of the view that what the bondholders expect is simply not what PREPA and the customers of PREPA can afford. So that is still a big issue. the restructuring of the debt, the fixing of PREPA, where the general fixing is at this point is the governor brought in a private operator to operate PREPA, a company called Luma. It's in the process of trying to bring in a private operator to Luma operates transmission and distribution. Is going to try to bring in an operator and has picked a preferred candidate in a competition to choose a private operator to run the old generation assets. If that goes through, that'll be another step towards fixing PREPA, but PREPA is not fixed yet. That's one of the big open issues. The other big set of open issues is what I call creating fiscal responsibility for the long haul. And that includes things like civil service reform, which will ensure that hiring is done competitively and that salaries are regularized. Puerto Rico needs to get its audited financial statements up to date. They're actually making some progress on that and some things of that sort. By way of conclusion, what I'll say is my view personally is that before Puerto Rico's status issue is resolved, and as I've alluded to and as most people who are watching this will know, there are a variety of different positions in Puerto Rico on status. Should Puerto Rico become a state? Should it become independent? Should it continue to be a territory or a commonwealth, but with more benefits than Puerto Ricans now have? Those status issues, in my view, will not be resolved until Puerto Rico is balancing its budgets again. And so I think what we're doing isn't related to the status issue in any direct way, will hopefully help pave the way to solving the status issue, or for Congress's interest in solving the status issue. How long will this board be around? Well, I won't be around too much longer. My term is up in January of 2024, and I cannot imagine serving past then. By then, I will have served more than 7 years. But the board will be around until there are 4 consecutive balanced budgets in Puerto Rico. There's a little bit of play in exactly what that means, but it's possible that Puerto Rico had its first balanced budget this fiscal year, ending June 30th. And so it's possible that, it's likely that the board will be around for 3 more years. It's quite possible. Well, it's possible that the board will complete its work in 3 more years. Not likely, in my view, unless Congress intervenes to shorten that period. Not likely that it'll be less than 3 more years. But it is at least conceivable it would be 3 years from now. And I will stop with that. Thanks.
Hello. Okay, let's thank Professor Skeel for a absolutely fantastic presentation. And we're open for questions or comments, either online or in the audience here at OCOMIC. Please raise your hand electronically or physically.
David, thank you for your talk. I'm interested in, since you've been there so long, 7 years almost, interested in what you might have learned from other territories and commonwealths that we have. For instance, Guam and American Samoa, I don't see them having these problems. Virgin Islands, Northern Marianas, again, I don't hear about these problems. When you look around, is Puerto Rico singular with all these issues? Or have you learned something from these other places, or can you help them?
Thanks for your question. We focused on Puerto Rico rather than the other territories. There's not a possibility for an oversight board for another territory unless Congress were to step in and to appoint one. PROMESA was set up so that it appointed or it provided for the appointment of a oversight board for Puerto Rico, but for any other territory, it would require Congress to step in again, although it could use the same statutory provisions. There is some financial distress in the territories. The Virgin Islands, I think, is in difficult financial straits. I'm not sure about the other territories. I don't see any movement to appoint an oversight board there. Puerto Rico was special in some respects because of how big it is and how many citizens live in Puerto Rico. But it was a major intervention, and so there'd have to be something, I think, to get Congress's attention and to persuade Congress that nothing short of an oversight board is sufficient. It's obviously a very, very major intrusion. So I don't see it coming right now, although there is at least one territory, and I think maybe more, that does have some financial difficulties.
Thank you, David. Do you see the chat question? It says, any new developments?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That was something I was gonna offer up regardless. So I'm glad to be invited to offer it up. The main new development from my personal perspective, but it's also from the oversight board perspective as well, is we were without an executive director from April of last year through the end of the year. Our executive director, who had served for 5 years, stepped down, and the executive director is a really key player because they run the oversight board, the board and the board staff on a day-to-day basis, and it's a big staff. We've been close to 100 at points. Right now we have about 80 people on staff, so it's a really big job. Not having an executive director was very taxing for me as the chair of the board last year, but we brought in a new executive director, a guy named Robert Mujica, and he's just spectacular. He was the budget director for the state of New York for the last 7 years and had been in New York state government, both on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, for 25 years. He is of Puerto Rican descent. His parents and grandparents both grew up in Puerto Rico. He spent lots of time in Puerto Rico, and he's just terrific. So that's a big development for me personally and for the board as well. The other development is the private operator I referred to in the talk to run the electricity company's old generating plants, what we call its legacy assets, was brought in. It's a company called Genera. And so that's moving forward, but everything else was pretty current as of what was true in October is pretty much still true now. We've not yet finished the electricity company restructuring. The judge has made very clear she would like that to be finished this summer, and ideally by the end of July. So that there's a lot going on there, but it's not done. And that's kind of where we are. Most of what I talk about in the talk is still accurate today, a few months later.
Any other comments or questions?
We have one here. While we're moving the mic, tell me what your wanted posters still say.
Well, what I see when I look at the wanted posters is when they did the wanted poster, I had almost no gray hair. when I did the talk in October, I had a little bit of gray hair, and now I have more gray hair. There were a bunch of protests about around that time on the mainland, including a couple. There was a small protest outside my office in around that same time, which was 2018, the summer and fall of 2018. There are regularly protests still in Puerto Rico on the island. We get protested quite frequently, not quite as frequent on the mainland. I think we've been there a long time, and I'd like to think that we're doing such a great job that folks don't want to protest anymore. I'm not sure that's their view of the situation, but there have not been wanted posters recently, and it'd be fine with me if there were not wanted posters again.
Another question here from our audience.
David, Dick Elnicki here. You know, I've been following you for your participation in this for a number of years. In retrospect, is there one thing that you did during these 7 years that you would go back and change, given what you now know?
Gosh, that's a great question. Is there one thing that I would change? Gosh, it's hard because so much of what has happened has taken us by surprise. All of the natural disasters, we just we weren't ready for, just as no one else really was ready for. There have been a couple of missteps. One of them, I don't think I talked about it in this talk. I think I've talked about it before at Okamic, is after Hurricane Maria, we were very worried about the electricity company, and we thought there needed to be radical change very quickly. And we intervened and essentially tried to take it over after the hurricane. We asked the judge to let us put in place what we called a chief transformation officer. And we kind of overshot with that. I think if we were to do it over, we would have been a little bit less aggressive about what we asked for. We asked to pretty much completely take over the electricity company, and it limited our ability in the short run to drive change there. So that would be one thing I think that I would change, and that we all would change. I'm sure there are other things as well, but that's the one that stands out. That was the one really big mistake I think that we made during our time.
Comments, questions? I
Nothing
have a
from
general
Mom and Dad?
question, and that's, could you tell us about who you believe are the winners and losers over the short term and over the long term from the debt restructuring?
Well, I'd like to think that that everybody's a winner in the long run, because it was needed, and it really was a great restructuring in the end. I even a year later, I'm very, very happy with the way it worked out. So I don't see there as being lots of big losers. I guess you would say the creditors didn't get paid in full, most of them, so they lost some of what they were owed. They didn't get it all back. The pension beneficiaries, although they were treated very well, didn't get everything. They lost cost of living adjustments. Those are frozen. So in a sense, everybody bore a little bit of, there was a little bit of sacrifice that across the board, everybody had to bear. But I really do think in the long run, it's mostly upside. It really is. It's a good restructuring. It really limits the amount of debt Puerto Rico has going forward. And the key now is just to be responsible legislatively, live within their means. There still are issues there. The legislature regularly passes laws that involve spending that's not in the budget. So there still is a little ways to go. But from the restructuring itself, I think it was mostly upside. Everybody had to bear a little bit of sacrifice, but just about everybody made out pretty well.
In your opinion, do you think there will be a statehood for Puerto Rico in the future?
There will be a statehood what?
For Puerto Rico in the future?
It's very difficult to tell. As I mentioned in the talk, I think I mentioned in the talk, there is legislation bouncing around Congress that would create a binding vote on whether Puerto Rico wants statehood or independence. At this point, there's a lot of resistance to letting that go forward. If it were to result in a vote for statehood, and if that were to lead to put Puerto Rico on the path to statehood, Republicans tend to worry about it because they're afraid that statehood would mean 2 new Democratic senators, 4 or 5 new Democratic congresspeople, and so there are impediments to resolving the status issue, and well, there are impediments to resolving it in any way. What I will say is I don't want to predict, in part because I feel like I need to be pretty cautious about what I say about the status issue as long as I'm on the oversight board. But what I will say is that, in my view, the current status is not sustainable. The fact that Puerto Rico doesn't have voting representation in Congress, they don't vote in presidential elections, I think is deeply problematic. And I do think the status issue needs to be resolved. I'm not sure when I think it will be, but it definitely needs to be. And I would like to think that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, we'll be able to look back and say it was resolved.
Anything for Mom and Dad?
I think the introduction said it all, and more than all. It was a great introduction. I don't know how.
Fantastic presentation, and thanks for being with us one way or another for today's presentation.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, and hopefully I can be with you in person again soon.